Welcome to Happy Homes and Gardens. I'm your host. My name is Daphne Royce. I am a real estate broker, architecture, and interior designer. Champagne was originated in the 17th centuries in France and was often served at Marie Antoinette's extravagant parties in Versailles. We still consume champagne at most of the celebrations. Gary Westby has a very special job as a champagne buyer. I am excited to have him here. Tell us all you need to know about champagne. Hi, Gary.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for having me on.
Doing well. Please tell us about you and how you become a champagne buyer.
Well, I've been doing the champagne buying for K&L Wine Merchants now for 22 years. I started in 2000, um, but I got my passion for wine from my father, who's still a avid collector and wine lover. He's actually coming this weekend, and we'll definitely open some nice bottles while he's here. Um, so that's how I got my start. I was basically playing music. I was playing the bass as part of a really rotten living, and my dad told me that, hey, instead of working part time in bike shops, you should work part time in a wine shop. And I looked around for a job, and I got hired, and I got a raise. And I tell you, the only way you can get a raise in the wine by joining the wine business is if you're in the bike business. But it's been a huge passion and gigantic luck for me to end up specialized in champagne. I was working with a competitor of K&L's that unfortunately has gone out of business during the run up to Y2K. So in 1999, and there was a huge amount of interest in champagne, and that's where I really got my love for champagne, was on the job. And starting in 2000, the first recession with the dot bomb really allowed an opportunity to expand into direct importation of champagne, as well as dealing with the big brands that control most of the U.S. market. So now at K&L, we're doing both. You know, of course, you can find giant brands like Veuve Clicquot and Dom Perignon, but you can also find very small growers, some having as little as 7 acres of land, and oftentimes at very interesting prices.
Is a champagne seen as a sparkling wine?
You know, that's a great question, because there's a lot of confusion with the word champagne. You know, champagne is an appellation. It's a controlled area in France with very specific rules. Um, and it is a sparkling wine, but not all sparkling wines are champagne. Champagne is definitely a sparkling wine, but it's not the case that it's only from that one area. They joke that it's an area that's just north and east of Paris, and it's on the same lines of latitude as Fargo, North Dakota, and Winnipeg, Canada. So it's way up north, and they joke that it's terrible weather, 225-page rule book, and chalk soil that make champagne.
I am such a foodie. If I would like to have a glass of champagne, what kind of food to pair with?
Oh, it is perhaps the most flexible wine in the world with food, and it there's very little that disagrees with it. But for me, some of the things that agree with it the best are sushi. I'm crazy about sushi and champagne, and we try and do it at home. Have sushi and champagne once a week. Um, it's a marvelous pairing. Of course, it goes very well with shellfish, scallops, oysters. Uh, Also, some of the richer, older cuvées of champagne that are aged for longer can go very well with pâtés and charcuterie. So I think that there's a wide range of things. And if you go to the region, they do all of the restaurants, all of the good restaurants offer pairing menus where every course is paired with a different champagne. Um, they even pair it with steak there. Um, I I think that Cabernet based wines go better with steak, and Bordeaux and California Cabernet don't go with much, but they go really really well with steak. So I figure it's a pity to miss an opportunity to have your steak with a good Cabernet or Bordeaux, but it's not a bad combination with champagne. So it's very very flexible with food.
Can you share how champagne is made and processed?
Oh, well, it's quite the process. And it starts just like any other wine, being grown in the vineyard. In Champagne, they have to respect only certain methods of training the vines, um, and only certain methods of pruning the vines. They then also have to respect set yield limits, um, controlled all by the Committee Champagne, the appellation. But after it's harvested, it must be all harvested by hand, um, because interestingly enough, they're making predominantly pure white wine, out of predominantly red grapes. So Pinot Noir makes a big third of Champagne. Meunier, which is an indigenous grape, also a dark skinned grape, that makes a small third, and Chardonnay makes up only about 25% of the total. So they have to harvest by hand because machine harvesting would prematurely damage the grapes and start an early maceration of the skins and the juice. So they have to press it very very quickly, and very very gently, so they can extract just white juice from these dark grapes and not allow them to macerate with the skins. One thing a lot of people aren't aware of is that even super super dark wines that we think of like Cabernet, like Syrah, if you squeeze the grape itself, it's white juice, and it's only like a maceration process of the contact of the skin with the juice that allow it to turn red, and in some cases quite dark red, almost black. But in Champagne they don't want that, so they press it. They then do a regular alcoholic fermentation, which makes what they call vin clair, which is just a still wine from Champagne. After that, they bottle it with 24 grams of sugar and an addition of yeast. Well, 24 grams for every liter of wine, and an addition of yeast. And in the bottle, that yeast eats all of that sugar. So there's no sugar left. And it leaves behind 6 atmospheres, or almost 90 pounds per square inch of dissolved carbon dioxide. So, like a road bike tire, like a bomb, a huge amount of pressure inside the bottle. It also makes about an extra degree of alcohol. So, the wine arrives usually at around 12%, 12.5% of alcohol, in the end. And then they have to age it. And in Champagne, it's mandatory that they age it in the bottle, for a minimum of 15 months. And most good producers do not do less than 3 years. For anything with a vintage date, it's a minimum of 3 years of aging. But again, good producers, I don't think that we have anything on the shelf right now that's vintage that's younger than 2015. So that's 7 years from the vintage. Not three, and 6 years from the bottling, not three. So after that, they have to riddle it down. Many people have seen the busy riddlers, videos of them twisting all the bottles a quarter turn, every bottle, the millions of bottles in the cellar. But that process is most often now done with a machine, called a gyro palette, which just takes a little twist, on a timer. They work all night, and they don't get carpal tunnel syndrome. It's definitely a trick to do that stuff by hand. And then after it's riddled down, the yeast is removed by a process called disgorgement, and They by turning them, they force all of the sediment down into the bottom of the bottle. It's then the cap is removed. It's almost always a beer cap that the wine's aged on. Um, the cap is removed, the yeast is shot out, and at that point they might add a little bit of finishing sugar called dosage in with a little bit of mixture of wine to make up what was lost with the ejection of the yeast. It's corked up, it's rested usually for another 6 months, and then it's ready to be sold. So it's quite an involved process. And normally good producers aren't selling anything that by the time it gets to market isn't at least 4 years old, with 3 years of time actually on the lees.
That takes quite a bit time to process to make a bottle of champagne.
It does, and the vineyards are very very valuable. The grapes are very very valuable. Some very very high grape prices in Champagne for people who are purchasing grapes to make their wines, um, and it takes a huge amount of space, because it takes a lot less space to keep wine in barrels and tanks than it does to keep them in bottle. So in the end, I think while champagne is never cheap, um, for fine wine, I think that there's still a lot of value in it, especially if you can get a good one at a really really good one at K&L for $35, which puts it in the range that a normal person for a special occasion can afford it.
So you mentioned earlier that was a three different type of grapes. Those only three types of grapes can make champagne.
You got all the best questions. It's they are the other grapes aren't on the test, but there are a small amount of other grapes that are allowed in the appellation. There's a few of them that are indigenous. There's a one called Arbonne and one called Petit Melier, which are indigenous to the region. These are now being looked at pretty seriously, as perhaps a way, a hedge against global warming, because they're very 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 high in acid, and they tried to get rid of them. They didn't ban them, but when the phylloxera louse struck, they only made the subsidy for replanting in France for the three grapes that we talked about already. So that effectively almost wiped them out because everybody was broke. Their vineyards were dying from phylloxera, and they needed the subsidy. Um, there's also Pinot Blanc is also allowed. That's actually the most popular grape after the big three. But that being said, I mean it's next to nothing. I mean all of the other grapes put together don't account for 1%. And also Pinot Gris is allowed, and then there are Gamay is also allowed. I've never ever seen it. Never seen a Gamay plant in more than 50 trips to Champagne. Never tasted a champagne that had Gamay in it, but it does exist. And apparently there's a new experimental grape that's being allowed in the appellation, which is also too new for me to have tasted.
Are there certain ways to store champagne and how long they will be good for?
Cellaring champagne. I just got back from a trip to Champagne Lambois, one of our oldest direct imports, in the village of Ménil, and we did a tasting there, where we tasted stuff from the early 2000s, from the 90s, from the 80s, from the 70s, and we went all the way back to 1959, and all of the wines were still fresh and delicious, totally drinkable. My favorite wine of the whole lunch, where we consume many, 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 many wines, was the 1975. So champagne is capable of extraordinary longevity, but it's super sensitive to storage. And when they talk about the chalk in Champagne, most of the time they're talking about the chalk in terms of it being a good soil with good drainage, and great properties for the grapevines. And I think that they undersell the chalk as possibly the easiest of all soils to excavate. Because it's so easy to excavate, they have the biggest and arguably the very, very best sellers in the entire world in Champagne, with a totally dead even 55-degree temperature year in, year out. Um, it's so easy to dig the stuff out that they have a moratorium on it in the city of Epernay, because there are more miles of tunnels by a lot under the city than there are roads above it. And it's Swiss cheese. I mean, they're pushing the limit, and they don't want stuff to start falling into the holes. So it's definitely it's the storage conditions are so critical. And I think that without those great caves, you probably wouldn't have champagne, because you need a place to store it for a long time. So when the customer gets it home, if they have a good quality wine refrigerator, a good quality temperature controlled cellar, or a good quality, earth in the earth, down deep cellar, um, the wines can be kept for decades. Even non-vintage wines, I think they unambiguously improve for 2 or 3 years in good storage. Bad storage is really bad for champagne, and it can go south in a hurry. As we were talking about before we started it rolling today, one hot day in the car can really mess your wine up pretty bad.
Question about champagne in France. And I know France has a lot of vineyard almost throughout the country. Why is champagne only produced in such small region in France?
So there the reason that it's only produced in a very small region is because it's only that area is the only place that's really suitable for making the style of wine that has been come to know as champagne. It could be technically feasible to add on to the appellation some stuff that was included in some areas that were included in the past. They almost did that about 10 years ago, and then they politically it got, and it was a quagmire, and it got jammed up. I think right now it's completely planted. There's no area that could be champagne, that could have the appellation, that doesn't have vines on it, or isn't just waiting after being dug up to be replanted. um, Potentially they could add a small percentage more. There's some area in just north of where the limit is now that has the right type of chalk soil. But there's not really a lot of area that is suitable, that has the right soil and the right climate.
And I also like to know why ladies always more attract to champagne. Is it due to the historical issues or its taste?
You know, Women are much, much better tasters physiologically than men. And I think that has something to do with it. I think that women have better palates, so they tend to gravitate towards the better things more quickly than men do. But I think the history is also a huge part of it. It's always been associated with elegance. It's always been, of course, had a great association, as you mentioned, with Marie Antoinette, with other great celebrities around the world, and I'm sure that also plays a part in it. But I think the beautiful light nature of the wine, that still never lacks depth and complexity, is just very, very attractive for modern women, and also for the food that the lighter food that modern women eat. So personally, I I'm very, very grateful that most of my customers are women, because women also they don't seem to forget that they're that they're into something because they like it. And with men, boy, with some of the whiskey guys, it's just like you wonder. It's like, man, you remember that the reason that you won't that you're doing this is because you like it? They get so caught up in the minutia and concerned with things that might be a little less relevant that it's sometimes disappointing. But luckily, it doesn't seem like many women fall into that trap.
And I think champagne is pretty.
It is
I love
pretty.
that little bubbles in the champagne glass. Wondering what colors are in champagne.
Oh, another great question. Um, the committee champagne has made red champagne illegal. So there is a separate appellation called Coteau de Champenois Rouge for still red wine from the area, but for champagne proper, red is not allowed. So you're allowed to have it white or you're allowed to have it rosé, but they don't have a way of defining the difference between rosé and red. So I had a great friend who's unfortunately passed away, whose wines we used to import, Pascal Leclerc, and he made a dark rosé called the Rubis rosé. And the committee always used to give him a hard time for it and say, "Man, this is red champagne," and he'd say, "No, it's pink." And they didn't have like it's not like there's a color like a Pantone wheel or something that you can't go past. So um, effectively, you can make it pretty dark and get away with it since they don't have a great definition for it. But in fact, the colors range, I would say, from almost clear for young Blanc de Blanc, young pure Chardonnays, um, through a marvelous array of white gold, light straw, all the way out to pretty deep golds when you're talking about old stuff, like some of these ones that we were just I was just tasting with the Lamois, from the 50s and the 70s. They can be quite golden.
So when you taste champagne from 50s and 70s, are those bottled champagnes still taste as good as it did originally?
They taste totally different than they do when they're young. And I've been in the business now long enough to have tasted stuff, have an opportunity to taste the same wine, young and old, and they change a lot. But for me, I would say for the most part they improve. It's not to everybody's taste. Um, the all of the the granddaughters of the Lamois family, the ones that are in their in their early 20s, none of them like the taste of old champagne. But for champagne connoisseurs, the taste of old champagne is very sought after, and a huge premium is paid for these old champagnes. They get more and more brioche like. Um, they get more and more complex. They definitely get weightier, uh, but the bubbles can survive for as long as people can. So they stay effervescent, and the best ones have both vinous, deep, profound character, and also but manage to maintain their acidity and their brightness. So the very best of them give you both things.
I recently checked online and bottle of a 1959 Dom Perignon Rosé costs nearly $74,900. Is this a sound right to you? Can it be so expensive?
um, well, you know, they have a very interesting system with Dom Perignon, and what you might have seen, it might have been at one of their P3 offerings. So they will age. They call their current release so the 2012 that they're selling right now. They call that the P1 or the Plentitude One. So that's when they figure that it's mature enough to sell. So that's what is that? That's 10 years old. Um, and then they hold back a large amount of the production um, for a second release, which they called the Plentitude 2. So currently, the Plentitude 2 is on 2003. so almost 20 years, 19 years old. And then they have another set where they figure the wine has reached its really its fullest potential of aging on the lees. And these are all freshly disgorged. We were talking about that process of riddling down and disgorging. So these are all wines that have been kept in the cellar. So the Plentitude 3, they're selling stuff, from the 80s, from the 70s, from the 60s, and perhaps, as you saw, that 59 could be from that program. But I would argue that at $75,000, that's a way of getting in the Robb Report, not a way of selling wine. And oftentimes for these big companies, if they have 100 of these bottles, it's better to list them at a price where they won't sell, but something that gets a lot of attention rather than at a price that will sell.
How interesting.
Yeah, a lot of the producers just won't sell them at all because at that age, we say in the wine business that there are no great old wines. There's only great old bottles of wine, and because the fermentation, all the most important development happens in the bottle. That secondary fermentation, that aging on the lees, they happen in individual bottles. When you get out that old, there can be quite a bit of variation from two bottles that were basically sitting next to each other in the same cellar. So a lot of people prefer not to sell them, but to use them for tasting events where somebody qualified from the maison can taste them first, and if there's one that has a problem, reject it.
Since you mentioned about bottle, I noticed champagne has a different bottle sizes. Can you explain why they doing
Oh,
that?
so the bottle sizes in champagne to me are really fascinating. So with all wines, all wines are offered in a variety of sizes, and with red wine for aging, the bigger the bottle, the slower it ages because you have basically the same amount of air, that little nickel size of air in, but much higher volumes of wine as you go up in size. But in champagne, you not only have that, but you also have the fact that the bubbles, and all of the most important development are happens. The bubbles are born. All the most important development happens within the bottle. So, you have in champagne, the most common sizes are half bottles, 750s, standard size bottles, 750 milliliters, and then magnums, which is a double size bottle, or 1500 milliliters. But there's also 187s, which are a half of a half. They call those splits. And then it goes on up. There's the Jeroboam at 3 liters. There's the Methuselah at 6 liters. There's the Nebuchadnezzar at 9 liters, all the way on up to the Primat at 30 liters, which is the biggest one I've ever seen. But they're only commanded by law to bottle ferment them in half, 750, Magnum, and Jeroboam. So the 187 size, they're allowed to transfer, to pour them out of bottles to fill the other ones. So the quality just takes a huge hit on anything that's transferred. Anything above 3 liter, they're also allowed to transfer. So you want those to be fresh, unless the producer is doing a bottle fermentation in those large sizes. The glass becomes much less consistent. So you'll see in the cellars people that are doing 6 liters and 9 liters actually in the bottle and bottle fermenting them. They wrap them in plastic
Oh,
because if they explode because of an inconsistency in the glass, and the glass isn't as consistent as the 750s are, they can hurt somebody, and they can take out a lot of bottles next to them. So you'll see them wrapped in plastic. So just in case there's a problem, it just spills out on the floor and doesn't stab anybody in the neck with glass. But the big bottles are a lot of fun. We actually sell quite a few of them, mostly for corporate milestones. It's that's the 30 liter that I sold was to a real big company that probably everybody knows the name of here in Menlo Park, for one of their milestones.
Do you have any recommendation if a beginners like to try out champagne? What do you recommend?
Oh, well, I first of all, I would just say go for it, you know. Um, what I would recommend is, to find a retailer that you trust, a good wine store. You can always come and see me at K&L. I'm there on the sales floor 3 days a week. Um, and if you want to educate yourself on them, it's really fun to compare a few, side by side. And champagne really does well, with a if you have a champagne stopper and you open it up and you pour a couple of glasses and stick a stopper on it and get it into the body of the refrigerator rather than on the door where it's getting shaken around every time you reach in there for the mustard. It'll last extremely well because it basically has its own inert gas, the CO2, coming up out of the wine to force out the oxygen and preserve the wine against oxidation. So it's like, having a gas system, except the gas system is in the wine. But they last very well. So if you get a couple and you open them, to compare them, and maybe one that's a Blanc de Blanc, 100% Chardonnay, and one perhaps that's a Blanc de Noir, that's all dark grapes, that can make a very, very interesting comparison and be quite a revelation. Because most of the time, champagne is not tasted carefully. Most of the time, it's served as an aperitif. You're at a party. You're trying to remember people's names. It's given to you cold. It's given to you in a flute that's probably very, very narrow that makes the bubbles look pretty, but difficult to get the schnoz in to smell. That pours the wine in a very thin line over your tongue, rather than a wider brim glass will pour the wine in a wider swath over your tongue and allow you to taste it better. A wider opening will allow you to smell the wine better. So I would say if you're at home and you're tasting it, put it in a wine glass, instead of a flute, or put it in both and check out the difference. The flute's going to make it look a lot prettier. It's going to save that fountain of bubbles, but you're going to be able to smell it and taste it better out of a regular wine glass. So I would say that if you're interested in learning more, starting out by doing a comparison, of a couple of champagnes that are in different styles, and starting out by using perhaps a couple of different vessels. The CO2 does a lot for transferring aromas. So the CO2, will carry aromas up through the wine, and, it definitely makes champagne less sensitive to the vessel than other wines. But it is a pretty big difference. If you've got a narrow flute in a regular wine glass, you can smell and taste a lot more in the regular glass.
That's great to know. I would never try in a wine glass for my champagne. The last question for you. You mentioned earlier about champagne, different color, white and rosé. Do they have a different taste? What
Absolutely. And they're very variable. Rosé champagne, is made primarily in two different ways, or a combination of the two ways. It's either made by an addition of red wine, so the producer will make a small batch of totally dark red wine with a long maceration of the skins and the juice, and then they'll add in, between 5 and 12% of that until they get the right aromas and colors, in the right color. That's the most common way of making rosé champagne. Um, the the other way is to have all of the skins in contact with all of the juice. That's much less common, because all of the skins have to be perfect. If there's a little bit of botrytis on the skins, or a little bit of rot, um, it's not really a problem for white juice because they press it gently and quickly. But if you're macerating the botrytis grapes with your juice, it doesn't take very many, poor quality skins to ruin the whole batch. So for the addition method of adding red wine to white, the most popular one, the most famous one is Biacart Samon. and that is very, very elegant, very light pink in color, but still has that strawberry fruit, that elusive fruit that you get with rosé, that you don't get with white champagne. The biggest proponent of skin contact is Laurent Perrier, and they're the Laurent Perrier non vintage rosé. All of the skins are in contact with all of the juice, entirely from Grand Cru grapes. They have to do a big selection for that, and with that wine, you definitely get a lot more of the sort of cherry aromas while still maintaining a completely dry and elegant wine. But that's another great comparison. If people are interested in, those are the two sort of benchmark rosés, and they can be very, very fun to compare.
Thank you so much, Gary. They are very informative information for my listeners.
Oh, well, you're most welcome, and thank you so much for the time. And if anybody has any questions for me, if they've got an interest in Champagne, I'm easy to find. I'm at K&L in Redwood City. My If you search K&L Wines and Gary Westby, you can find me on the staff directory. Find my email, which is just GaryWestby@klwines.com. I'm also on Instagram at Champagne Gary Westby. You can reach out to me that way as well.
Great. I will link your websites to the video.
Thank you so much for your time, Daphne. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Bye.